back to another episode of the BFR Better for Results podcast. My name is Nick, as you very well know, hopefully, I assume. Today is going to be a fun day because I'm here with Joel Novak, Dr. Joel Novak, physical therapist. We're going to discuss our recent paper that was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning, or Strength and Conditioning Journal, on debating the use of arterial occlusion pressure in research and practice. So the point of this podcast will be to go through our points, serve as a reference for those that may not want to read the paper or want to read the paper and get more detail from the two lead authors themselves. That'll be fun. I'm very passionate about blood flow restriction in general, and I think that this is one area that has the potential to obfuscate a lot of the direction of the field. And I think it's really important that we were able to get a group of people together to have a spirited debate on this. So with Joel, his background, he's an orthopedic and sports medicine physical therapist with 20 years of clinical experience. And as I mentioned before, holds a doctorate in physical therapy and certified through the National Strength and Conditioning Association as a certified strength and conditioning specialist. He is a certified instructor in blood flow restriction training and has advanced education in the diagnosis and treatment of movement and muscle imbalances with the FMS, the functional movement systems. As a team physical therapist for the Indy 11 USL soccer team, as well as the Indy Fuel ECHL hockey team, and Fisher's Freight. That sounds like a toy company.
They're arena football.
Oh, okay. For Fisher's Freight IFL football team. Joel's worked closely with professional athletes as well as student athletes from the surrounding school systems. He's an assistant professor at Quincy University in the doctoral PT program. Did they just get their credential?
They're going in the process.
All right, they're in the process of getting credential, and has regularly educated graduate students as an adjunct faculty member at the University of Indianapolis for the Krannert School of Physical Therapy. On a personal note, which I'll let him kind of talk about, I will only say this as well. He has the owner and content director of My Performance Rehab, and is a physical therapist in the Northeast Indianapolis area of Hamilton and Madison counties. And he is blessed to be treating patients part-time in partnership with Grace in Motion in Pendleton, Indiana. Yeah. The one thing I will say, I always am not shy about my passion for blood flow restriction, but I do not sell any cuffs. I do, my sole interest is simply helping us understand blood flow restriction and being able to leverage that information into practical takeaways. So I have an education company, as you all know, the BFR Pros, and Joel is a reseller for Be Strong. He can briefly talk about that, but at least that's our biases coming in. But I will say, in having conversations with Joel back and forth probably over the last couple of years, I think he shares similarly, even though I think we would disagree or agree to disagree in certain areas. I think we both are passionate about growing blood flow restriction and just trying to make sure that we can leverage this technology to help as many people as we possibly can, both as physical therapists, but also as trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, etc. So with that, I'll just hand it off to Joel before we get started.
Yeah, no, it's a great intro. I appreciate it, Nick. We've been talking for several years now, on and off, and we definitely have good spirited back and forths on stuff, and we ultimately, I think, are coming from the same place, that we're willing to check our biases as the research kind of unfolds and have a conversation about what that means and maybe what it doesn't mean. And ultimately, we both believe strongly that BFR is a great avenue for rehab, as well as some enhancement in performance metrics potentially as well, that's kind of new and coming out. But ultimately, my takeaway has always been BFR works because the human body works. Like I've always said that, like, we are tapping into the natural physiology of stress and recovery, and BFR is just tapping into that. So there's lots of ways to do that, is my takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I would agree. I think, and this is where we'll get into this, I think it's important also, because this doesn't make the research papers, which is how the genesis of this paper actually came about. And if you all haven't known, my main interest in blood flow restriction is is on device features and characteristics, and that has been born through the BFR pros in being able to get my hands on a lot of these different cuffs and understanding through conversations with manufacturers that different cuffs are supposed to be, advertised to do different things, whether they're supposed to help with efficacy, whether they're supposed to help with safety, comfort, things like that. But I started to notice that really there wasn't anything, any sort of spirited research interest into that, minus cuff width, and occasionally some of that. So um, we've we've kind of like had back and forth with some of my interests level with that with on Instagram and things like that. And so I was spearheading or am spearheading multiple different volumes of device features in Frontiers in Physiology and Sport and Active Living or something like that. And basically Joel came in and proposed a manuscript. This is probably back in, a year change ago, on discussion of AOP as a reference standard. And me, thinking otherwise of like, I think this could be something that could be very well spirited as a debate. And so from there, that kind of, I then got into my like research clinical, hat mode and record and basically sent out some texts, and we quickly established the framework for this paper. And then it kind of evolved from there. And then subsequently, Joel was able to go through and publish his paper in the next journal or the next iteration of the device features. So he got 2 publications out of it. So anyways, so let's get into it. So this paper is published in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. It's called a debate on the necessity, practicality, and importance of arterial occlusive pressure usage in blood flow restriction research and practice. And I am the lead author, Joel's second. And then we had our team of clinician researchers that were partnered with us. So when we had individuals that were arguing for the arterial occlusion pressure or limb occlusion pressure perspective, that was me, my frequent collaborator and partner in crime, Victor DeCaros, Luke Hughes, and Jeremy Leneke. So I brought in some heavy hitters.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's important because at least, for Jeremy, he's been the one that kind of initially started that migration back in 2012, 2013, of trying to figure out a way to standardize the application of blood flow restriction. So I brought him in. He's obviously one of the most well-published researchers in the space. And then Luke Hughes has become a friend to me. We've published a decent amount together and more upcoming. But he's also, just someone that does a lot of research into blood flow restriction. So his perspective is definitely more of we need to know what we're measuring, which is an important aspect of what we argued in our paper. And then Victor DeCaros is, my partner in crime, PhD. Now he's in Brazil and what have you. So, and then your team, if you want to just talk about your team, people that were there, who they represented, and why it was a good group for a counterpoint.
Yeah, I mean, we've got the crew that's over with Hydro, is a BFR company out in the UK. We've got a couple authors from there, and we've got another individual that is from Be Strong as well. And then we've got a representative from Katsu as well. There's just kind of a couple guys that are in the non-AOP space that are really trying to deliver and drive some of this narrative around AOP necessity versus non-AOP, and just sort of getting into the weeds a little bit about what all that means and maybe what it doesn't mean a little bit. Great group. They're very
and Josh,
absolutely, yes, and Josh Landers as well, yes. And
yeah,
he was a good citizen in this. He did a really nice job contributing to it. I didn't mean to leave anybody out there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's just overall really important that, you know, at the end of the day, and listen, like, I'm in a unique space in the field because I have spoken with a lot of these different companies and individuals that represent these companies. And at the end of the day, yes, it is business, but I do solemnly believe that that individuals in either camp are share our perspective of we love blood flow restriction from either from a clinical perspective, from an exercise physiology perspective, or a combination or a research perspective, right? We all love BFR and we're passionate about it. And I think we're at the point in the field where there is an inflection point that's happening. And we want to make sure that conversations that we feel are pertinent and relevant are happening and not all happening in individual silos. And
Yeah,
I believe that's kind of the, that's kind of the background of this. So I wanted to make sure that we had individuals that, yes, they have a vested interest, business wise, but generally based on my conversations with each and every one of them. I mean, I know everyone personally,
right.
but Tom Brownlee, although I know him through Warren,
For Warren.
and Josh Landers. Everyone else I've met personally and have had conversations with.
Yeah, you talked with Sten.
I've talked with Sten and
at the
conferences.
conferences, yeah.
And so, like,
And
I
Chris,
know
you've been
everyone
involved with Chris too, yeah? Like,
yeah,
yeah,
so
Chris is
that's
right.
why, and so that's why, for me, it's more like, okay, well, let's bring this all into the academic context
Totally.
and really go through. Which, to be honest, our review process actually was like pretty more intense. More intense than I thought it was going to be.
Totally.
And this is another example of peer review process being more intense and actually producing a better paper.
I agree with that totally. Like, I feel like after speaking with, all sides of this, like, everybody is driven to try to, it's not to argue. We're not trying to, I mean, obviously there's debate in the field, but it's mostly to try to collectively discern what's out there and how we approach this. So I totally agree with that.
Are you a leader in the rehab and fitness industry? Are you ready to meet the growing demand of BFR trained providers? Get our complete on-demand BFR training certification course now and get over 7 hours of continuing education by clicking the link on this page.
With that being said, we'll get into this. So the way that we set this article up was we wanted to quote unquote debate 3 questions. And so the first question is AOP necessary to ensure safety? The second question is, does AOP-based prescription meaningfully improve physiologic or clinical outcomes? And the last one is, does reliance on AOP enhance or limit external validity and real-world application? So the way that we're going to do this is I am going to go through the main points as a representative from the point camp, and then I'll hand it over to Joel for the counterpoint. If there are any sort of discussions that we'll have in between, that's great, but we'll want to get through in a timely manner for all 3 of the questions, and then have a little bit more of an open discussion at the end about pretty much the direction of blood flow restriction. All right. So with that being said, question 1, is AOP necessary for safety? And I think what the point's perspective on this is that AOP as a measurement doesn't inherently guarantee safety at all. However, what it does is it allows for a pretty much guarantee of subocclusive pressure application, particularly at rest, right? And we know that if you're using a non-AOP approach, and by non-AOP, we're also making assumptions with the listenership here, but the AOP is the amount of pressure needed to completely occlude all arterial flow. And so we set percentages of that, or it's recommended to be set as percentage of that relative to that value. So that that value is typically between 40 and 80% of the total arterial occlusion pressure. But when you use something like a non-AOP approach, there is a risk that you are setting a pressure that might either be too low to be therapeutic, which may or may not, be realistic. I think we have some preliminary data that shows that that's possible. And the more concerning aspect is it is too high, and thus we are now setting ourselves up, our clients and patients up, that may or may not have medical comorbidities for a more intense exercise experience and a potentially more risky. I don't want to use the word unsafe, because I think BFR, we both can argue that BFR has largely been safe and well tolerated in a variety of populations. But nonetheless, when you use a fixed pressure, so for example, if I have a wider cuff, and then this takes into variables that some researchers may or may not take into play. When you have a wider cuff, let's just say it's 10 centimeters or 12 centimeters long, so it's like a 4-inch-ish whatever cuff. And you find out that person, when you measure that person's limb occlusion pressure in the legs, it's 200 millimeters of mercury, or let's just say 180 millimeters of mercury for example's sake, because that's on the lower end of what I would expect a regular size thigh LOP to be, AOP to be, whatever. We use them interchangeably, limb or arterial occlusion pressure. Well, sometimes there are arbitrary pressure prescriptions that are 200 millimeters of mercury. So if you, without actually considering any of this, and you set the pressure to 200, you're now putting that exerciser at a supra-occlusive pressure for whatever exercise you're doing. And so the AOP allows you, as a clinician, as a researcher, to be able to at least understand what pressure you're applying it to. And this becomes more relevant as the industry itself is moving into more and more clinical populations that have comorbidities. And so just because, for example, that the majority of evidence that we've collected on blood flow restriction is in healthy individuals with minimal to no comorbidities, and the adverse event rate is very low, that doesn't mean that we automatically can assume that the same rates will apply to individuals that are diabetic, that have hypertension, maybe obese, and all these other cardiovascular comorbidities that may heighten the response to exercise. And so we know that AOP is not a perfect measure. We know that it's impacted by how big your limb is, by the cuff type, by the size of the limb. Did I say that again? Size of the limb, the cuff type, the size of the width of the cuff, the time of day, all of these things. But I do think it's important that we recognize that it's an imperfect measure, but it's a measure nonetheless that allows us to be defensible. And even though the arterial occlusion pressure may change during exercise, I think that it's the most important thing is understanding that the impact of BFR is probably, except in extreme circumstances, more relevant for when you're in the resting position and you're not actually exercising. And we want to make sure that there is some degree of not complete stasis, basically. And so the last part of the argument for safety wise is that when we start to think about defensible documentation and we list all the different ways in which we can now say, as a BFR clinician, we can control the amount of applied pressure, we can control the position of assessment of AOP, LOP, and note that we can control all these other variables associated with a prescription of AOP. And if we don't understand where the relative magnitude of that applied pressure is relative to a completely, occluded artery, well, then what happens when there is an adverse event, or if there is an adverse event and something happens, right? Were we exercising with that person in full occlusion, right? I don't think that that from a risk liability perspective, yes, I think we can all concede that proper programming is going to be instrumental regardless of what we do. But if you take proper programming and implementation along with, or if you take proper programming and then you layer on the implementation using, cuffs that are more rather than less precise, and use a more precise, even though it's imperfect, measure, I think from a risk and liability perspective, that will trump a randomly, and I say random, but I mean a pressure that is not relativized completely to the individual. And last, we know that higher pressures increase the cardiovascular and metabolic reflex response. So now you're getting into a situation where the exercise might not have more therapeutic effect, but now increased discomfort and the potential for the person to be like, I'm good about blood flow restriction. And
Yeah.
then, yeah.
Good.
No, good.
All right, man. No, I want to actually just read, because I think it's important in the non-AOP's stance, the very first paragraph of the counterpoint, and it says that non-AOP prescription should not be conflated with non-individualized prescription. While the point position frequently uses the language of fixed or arbitrary when referring to non-AOP BFR, the counterpoint position does not advocate for applying uniform restrictor pressures across all individuals, devices, limbs, or populations. Rather, it contends that individualization can be achieved through methods other than prescribing it as a percentage of measured AOP. And I only wanted to read that because I agree with most of what you said. Like, if you apply a device capable of fully restricting blood flow to a limb, meaning you can shut off the flow of blood to that limb because you're using a tourniquet capable of that, and you don't measure for AOP, you don't know that you haven't reached supra-occlusion. So I would argue, and I think the counterpoint's position is that throughout the points position, I think there's a lot of, and in fairness to the points position, a lot of the published research uses the terms fixed and arbitrary. So the point is simply recycling those words. And I would just argue that that's not helpful in the narrative of what non-AOP can be. And it's probably also of the onus of the non-AOP camp to do a better job of clarifying that. Because if you aren't setting any pre-exercise restrictive pressure parameters, then you are left with the fixed or arbitrary language behind it. And I would make an argument that you don't need arterial occlusion pressure. Not I would, the paper is making the argument that you don't need the arterial occlusion pressure measurement to apply that safely. For example, just simplistically, like if you put a cuff on at rest and you inflate it or you wrap it or whatever methodology you're using for restrictive pressure, and you can feel a distal pulse, you haven't reached occlusion. Like, I mean, it's really as simple as that. And I'm not saying that that's ideal, and I'm not saying, but in the argument of you need AOP to be safe, and I'm like, well, as long as you have arterial inflow, that's what all AOP is suggesting that it's doing as well in the safety realm. You're not reaching supra-occlusion. And so as far as the counterpoint's stances is that you should not be seeking to do that. Therefore, if you aren't doing that, then you're in the same operating parameters as AOP would be. And so then that's when we start talking about, and I know you're passionate about this, but like device characteristics as an example. And I would still make the stance that early research and maybe even some current studies where I think we'll have a good discussion later is we're not always calling apples. Sometimes we're comparing apples to oranges. And if you're using inelastic, nylon thick, wide, rigid cuffs, and you're comparing that to the restrictive pressures of elastic, more narrowed cuffs, you're going to get a different physiological stimulus. So I think we can agree to that. And I think the research supports that. But as far as safety is concerned, a couple of the points that, again, the framing of, I'm going to say the non-AOP side of things is that, like Jesse et al., their article about they used a stock restrictive pressure based on systolic blood pressure, and it was found that sometimes it went over occlusion pressure. Well, Swain's article et al. Also showed that a couple of AOP cuffs also touched a little bit beyond AOP as well. And that's in a product that's supposed to be able to control for keeping it out of arterial occlusion pressure and going up beyond that. And it wasn't, and even the devices themselves aren't capable of that all of the time. And I know that one of the arguments that the point paper makes is that that's a device feature problem, not a measurement problem of AOP. And I would agree with that. Like, so but also if you're the literature is calling for AOP to be the standard of care, then you have to make sure that the products that are out there are actually operating in that, or that's a weakness in the AOP's like ability to execute what they're claiming. Okay, so that's also problematic. So all of that to say that I think safety can be framed, and again, the research supports that it can be framed around cuff characteristics and ensuring that you're following a given device features to stay out of full occlusion. And measuring for AOP is absolutely one successful way to do that mostly, but non-AOP doesn't mean, again, arbitrary or fixed. And so like to Nick's point, I think a lot of research papers and a lot of people are still under the assumption that you shouldn't just put a pressure on without making sure that at a resting state, you, or at least at the very least, aren't fully occluding. And I would say you don't need AOP to do that as long as you have a device that's capable of a device that accounts for that, and you're following the programming that makes sure that you're operating in that as well. And then the last point I'll make about like on like the documentation side of it, it's like if you're able to reproduce your documentation, like you put what character, like what device you used, where you put it, the restrictive pressure you use, because a lot of non-AOP devices still account for some level of restrictive pressure, whether that's a width that you've wrapped, whether it's an inflation pressure, whether it's a skew unit for Katsu specifically, the setting that you put it on, how long it was on, the exercise dose that you did, like that's all defensible documentation that you can reproduce readily without having the one number that is an arterial occlusion pressure number. And again, I think there's value. So the last thing I'll say about the overarching position of the non-AOP is not anti-AOP, like at all. Like the non-AOP position, and all of the authors on this paper are not against arterial occlusion pressure. They're against sort of the claims that it's necessary and that it's like the only defensible, safe, and effective application of it. That's the larger position that the non-AOP group takes. So that's sort of the safety umbrella.
I think this goes, you made good points, but I will say that, and this goes back to what we were talking about offline, which is the impact of the vascular system with high load exercise. And I think that when you make the claim and you talk about supra-occlusion during exercise, I think I said it earlier, but it's really about resting stasis, because if you're creating a stimulus that has the potential to occlude at rest, well, then you change the risk profile inherently, and that's not even including what I become more interested in, which has little to no evidence, which is the venous system and the impact on the venous system. And so when you're using, and I understand there's an interplay between device characteristics and what have you, but when you're using a pressure, and this will get into my second point, when you're using a pressure that, has that, and the cuffs, for example, they go above occlusion. Honestly, from an arterial side or whatever, I'm not as concerned with acute, like high spikes in like the vascular stress from the arterial side. From the venous side, because it's much less, there's much less adaptability, I have more concerns, which is why, for example, I become more along the thought process that it's the resting condition between contractions that is truly the blood flow restriction. And that can go into the multi-chamber cuff, that could go into any sort of way that we're applying it, is because what we're trying to do is we're trying to create backlog in between the reps, so the metabolites don't leave. So when you're so it actually doesn't bother me that much, that study, the Swain study, regarding the sway of arterial pressure, because that's typically just, again, that's a measure of the potential arterial strain, which we know based upon healthy individuals, right? Now, again, as we're migrating to clinical, maybe there's a change in a little bit of that perspective. But when we're looking at intravascular measures of the ability of the arterial system to withstand high magnitudes of strain, I always go back to that McDougall paper in 1985, 480 over 350 in terms of instantaneous peak systolic and diastolic blood pressure response with a 90 to 100% of 1 rep max doing leg press, bicep curls, etc.
Right.
So I'm okay with instantaneous peaks in healthy individuals with limited cardiovascular comorbidities. We also know that the blood pressure response that was measured in recent studies is like 180, 200 or whatever, with the G and the France papers that actually looked at intravascular assessments with low load exercise and things like that. So it's like, I'm not that concerned. I am concerned with the venous, issue. And I can't get over personally how, if we're thinking about risk mitigation, how we can get over that without understanding the relative, where we are relative to our total occlusive pressure.
Yeah, I hear you on that, because like the biggest argument, the biggest uphill battle that I feel like I've had is, it's a very logical stance to have. Like, it's a logical stance to say, I don't want to, at rest specifically, have my blood flow restricted to full occlusion. And that is a very like, of course you don't. Like, that's a logical stance to have. And so if you're not measuring it, how do you know you're not overcoming it? And so but you've been on a published paper with a multi-chamber system where it wasn't capable of full occlusion. Like, so the argument is, that's not even a relevant argument right now with that specific device. And I don't want to talk, about.
That's the thing, right? Is that right now, listen, my thoughts on multi-chamber cuffs and I've published on this, back in 2023 with Sten, or 2024.
Yeah.
Looking at, listen, I do think that there is a place for multi-chamber cuffs in a fitness routine. In fact, I would recommend any personal trainer that's getting involved in blood flow restriction, go to the multi-chamber cuff. That takes away 99% of any sort of safety concerns due to the architecture of the cuff itself.
Right.
The problem is, people are not taking the time to separate the nuance from a single chamber cuff to a multi-chamber cuff. That's the problem. In fact, 2 days ago or yesterday, there's a paper that was just published that was looking at using a B-Strong cuff, again, applying a single chambered algorithm to a multi-chamber cuff, and then looking at, again, so this is happening with the people that are supposed to be experts in studying blood flow restriction. It's happening, and people are getting it. So how can we assume that the public or the lay clinician is able to, separate that? And again, it's one of like it's one of those things, like, personally, again, I have more flexibility as an educator, or rigid, just because I've dealt with, and you probably have too, as also like the challenges of trying to get people comfortable with applying blood flow restriction itself.
Yep.
Yes. So, like, I have people that are like, oh my gosh, like, if I'm applying 50% limb occlusion pressure in the arms, is that going to be, is their arm going to explode? Like, do I have to worry about, like, valve collapse and things like that? And I'm like, again, and so there's no way to be like, oh, actually, you know what? 120 millimeters of mercury. Let's do that. And good luck, and see how it goes.
Yeah. No, I would totally agree with, like, again, the problem that I keep going back to is the difference in the general public's education and the published authors' positions of, again, some of the language that gets used, like I'm going to say, like, the words like necessary, or like if they're going to talk about like eliminate, like sometimes in this paper specifically, like it was like, well, AOP eliminates the risk of that happening, or it ensures this thing. And it's like, yeah, but at the same time, we know that the downstream physiology, and I know we're not talking about that right now, we're talking about safety, but like the concept is it's varied, and the concept is it's a wide successful range. And the argument of safety is we don't want to be on the long side of that. Like, let's not even talk efficacy. Let's not talking about we're talking about the ceiling, not the floor. So like the AOP camp, I would argue, is their biggest safety argument is to make sure you're not over the ceiling. And I'm saying, but if you can do, like you're talking about the venous system, but if you're doing distal pulse checks and you're monitoring and you're like, and you've got a capability of elastic nature of a cuff that's not a nylon single chamber tourniquet, you're
But
if you're using
that's the whole thing.
yeah,
You got it right there.
yeah,
Which is again, when you're dealing with, and I'm glad you said that, because it really does, hammer us. It's like you already stratified in your mind, right, the risk of a single chambered system applying some sort of non-personalized pressure, and you have gone to a multi-chambered system
or
that's
other elastic like Katsu.
elastic, that's applying, or anything where again the material itself is not designed to fully occlude, and the device characteristic is such.
Right.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
when we're dealing with something where I can see in the practical sets, right, of if somebody gets familiar with the intricacies and the nuances of blood flow restriction, I don't think anybody that you would talk to on the pro AOP camp would argue that blood flow restriction applied even in a multi-chambered cuff, where even though the acute data suggests that yes, it is more fatigable than low load exercise alone, but significantly less fatigable than a single chambered system applied at a personalized pressure, we still get positive beneficial outcomes, right? The fatigability is there.
Are you a leader in the rehab and fitness industry? Are you ready to meet the growing demand of BFR trained providers? Get our complete on-demand BFR training certification course now and get over 7 hours of continuing education by clicking the link on this page.
I think what's really, concerning as we're hitting this inflection point, and particularly recently, right, with Hydro getting all this press for their recovery in England soccer players, right, where people are now getting more exposure. It's like the Olympics in 2021.
Right.
And so people are going to be interested in learning about these types of ways in which we can apply blood flow restriction. And it's just that, for me, it's almost like keeping the training wheels on with the AOP approach. Number one, like, as I mentioned, with just in general about studying it, right, which is the next question. But number two, about just the safety rails that people can go on. And then number three, it gives people comfort, because a lot of the times when, like, even dealing with individuals that are asking about an AOP based approach, there is frustration or there is a timidness, even when we're personalizing. So just trying to get as much structure inside of a BFR program as possible. And I think AOP is just one of those ways in which we can be more rather than less precise. And the technology itself is coming that at least allows us to be better at ballparking what a true AOP is. And I think that's a device problem with the reliability and potentially validity of some of these, devices, which is a separate discussion.
Yeah,
But
no. So like, last thing I'll say, we can move on to the part of it, is like my big contention is if you have a tourniquet based single chamber nylon cuff, I would argue you should use AOP. I would absolutely say if you're using a product that is operationally set up for when you go to inflate it, you don't know if you're fully occluding or not. You should measure that. I totally agree with that. But unfortunately, like when we're parsing out the language, you and I can have this nuanced conversation that you and I just talked about. We're conceding both ends. Like I'm conceding that you should use AOP in a product. You're conceding that AOP is not necessary if you're using different device features and stuff. And the point of that is the language behind what my concern is, the push in the academic world and in the publication of the literature is, I've even heard it from clinicians say, well, if you're not measuring AOP, then you're operating unsafely. And I'm like, that's not true though. That's not a true statement. And here's a publication that you and I are together with all these other authors that say that that's not true. Is there extra risk that we could mitigate? Are there other ways to do it? It's just like, but the evidence isn't non-AOP equals unsafe or ineffective, because that's clearly not true in the literature, and it's cited countless places. It's just, what are you using as your BFR product? And when you're saying, yeah, Joel, like I worry that people are doing this wrong. And I'm like, I agree with you, but the language that's being continued to put forward doesn't qualify the non-AOP side and what that might mean. It only says AOP equals X. And then that's an overreach. And that's what I worry about, is the AOP overreach of necessary, mandatory, ensuring. And it's just not doing any of those things. It's like the argument of it's the best we have. Is like, yeah, I don't want to not have guardrails. I don't want to just put whatever on and strap an inner tube around and tell everybody that's BFR. Like, that's not the claim. It's just more the nuance is what really matters. And as you're trying to elevate the field, and as I'm trying to elevate the field, the reality is in the nuance, and we have to get more literature that kind of says that, so that we can get the people that are using AOP devices incorrectly to actually use AOP, and the people that are using non-AOP devices to understand the difference in how the device features and that programming works. And that is still individualized and personalized. It's just not to a number. And so, like, that's my contention. And
I think where we can, agree and, move on is this, is that if you're using a single chambered system that has the capacity to occlude blood flow, especially with the technological advances of literally the last 2 to 3 years, would you agree? How about this? That if you have a traditional tourniquet-like cuff, and you're a clinician and you're working with individuals that have cardiovascular comorbidities or other things that may heighten the response to exercise both during and following the blood flow, that you would be, let's just say, negligent. That you would be negligent to not use arterial occlusion pressure in that setting with that particular cuff.
With that particular cuff in that way, there's no reason not to. Like, there's no reason not to use arterial occlusion pressure when the capability of the cuff, the device features, the programming, the protocol is capable of occluding your flow of blood. And you're just saying, let's just try 120, like, and just hoping that 120 millimeters of mercury is good without knowing that that's that person's ceiling with a device like that. Yes, I would say that is not wise.
So again, but that's the crux of what we're trying to argue in the theoretical sense, is that when the majority of cuffs that are implemented right now, whether I agree or not, different story. Majority of cuffs that are implemented and reported in the literature are all single chambered nylon wire.
If you're using like the why can't I think of it right now? The
Delphi, smart cuffs.
I'm thinking of the one that's mostly research based though. It's like literally Hokinson. Thank you. That's what I was thinking of. So, like, I would argue that, like, the internal validity of being able to have a pressure that you can measure has tons of merit in research and publications, and some of the, like, I fully agree to all of that. It's more of when we're equating BFR across the board with needing AOP, I'm going to dig my heels in repeatedly and consistently, because that's not factually true and that's not supported in the research. When you're using a cuff like what we're describing, that is a nylon inelastic based cuff that can fully shut off the flow of blood, and you don't have any idea if you're monitoring that you haven't done that, that is an unsafe practice and not recommended. And I agree with AOP in those metrics, which is why I keep trying to say that the counterpoint position is not anti-AOP. It's AOP is not clarifying their own position in the literature about other ways that successfully and safely, and again, the argument of, well, how do you know it's effective or it's not as effective? Because we know that the AOP has a certain amount of restrictive pressure, so we can dose that a little better. And I'm just like, not per the research. Like, the research doesn't support you saying that. It supports that restrictive pressure matters. It's saying that more restrictive pressure obviously has a bigger downstream effect, but that range is still so big that why can't a non-AOP product be in that range? And of course it can, And that's the stance. But I agree with you. If we can't all agree in the clinical world specifically, let's forget the personal training or fitness world. Let's talk about the clinical world. If we can't agree on the clinical world, the type of product you're using and your unfamiliarity with what it's capable of, and you're using that on a patient population without AOP, I do not agree that you're practicing in a proper way. Totally. Yeah, we can move on. But yeah, I think we're definitely on the same page with that.
All right. So question number 2, does AOP-based prescription improve outcomes? And so I think this is a really fun one because
I agree.
I think there is a lot of evidence that um, that suggests that there is the possibility. But let's just go through it. So our central claim is that there has been an effective range, meaning that there is a minimal amount of applied pressure that, according to a meta-analysis, for example, has shown to meaningfully accelerate fatigue, which I think we both can agree in the resistance training context. Low load blood flow restricted exercise is so beneficial because it accelerates fatigue and therefore it increases motor unit recruitment and type 2 muscle fiber recruitment earlier than what it would normally do, partially or not exclusively due to the fatiguing impacts of the metabolic stress. And so that's where, again, I circle back to my resting position, because if we're able to maintain some sort of restriction at rest, then we can get the benefits of blood flow restriction. That might be magnified through higher pressures. Therefore, we're creating a stronger backflow of venous of the venous flow, and thus maybe those metabolites are trapped more in relatively higher pressures. So anyways, Mikhail Cerqueira in Brazil, he published a meta-analysis that showed that greater than 50% limb occlusion pressure has accelerates muscle fatigue faster compared to low load exercise, but less than 50% does not. Meaning that basically in this paper was mostly in the lower body for a caveat, but just that if we're not using at least 50% pressure, in the totality of evidence, right? Obviously there's nuance, but the totality of evidence suggests that you will not meaningfully get the benefits of blood flow restriction using low loads. And then there's the HAP paper that looked at 100% AOP, so taking it to the extreme and looking at it versus 50% AOP, showing that that 100% accelerated the reps to fatigue by half relative to 50%. And it also had greater oxygen desaturation. Then we also have the Illet and Fatella papers, where they both kind of showed that 40% arterial occlusion pressure equaled no BFR control, but greater than or equal to 60% AOP meaningfully accelerated a muscle torque decline, increased that muscle activation, lactate, and hypoxic stress. And then we have the Mauser paper, 80% AOP plus 15% of the 1 rep max, so very low load, actually produced vascular adaptations that were comparable to high load exercise at 70% of 1 rep max, but 40% of AOP did not. And then we have chronic data from Alexandro that showed that 80% AOP produced quad hypertrophy at 20% of the 1 rep max, but 40% did not. And that was a lower dosed paper. So that might mean that, in general, we need to make sure that our prescription is we're giving enough volume to our clients to be able to elicit an effect. And then we also have the pain modulation. We have now 2 papers at least that show that 80% provides greater local analgesic response and varying systemic response than 40%. So there is a pressure dependent relationship of some sort. And I don't want to talk about, I mentioned my paper in there, and that's not necessarily as relevant, other than just showing that a personalized pressure at a single chambered system, enhance the fatigability relative to a multi-chambered system, inflated a little bit higher. But I think there's some nuance there. But that's generally the gist of of this. There's also clinical populations that we have that do 80% versus 40%. For example, in ACL reconstruction and high tibial osteotomy, there is an 80% group and a 40% group, and strength, muscle cross-sectional area, and functional outcomes were better in the 80% versus the 40%. So I do think that there is some pressure-dependent relationship that exists, that, beyond just stick them in a pressure and make it individualized. Whatever that means, in terms of a non-AOP based but individualized pressure prescription, where if we can put someone through a program of 30, 15, 15, 15, let's just say, and know that if we give them at 80%, we're going to get a better response than 40%.
Sure.
Then I think that, that's a strong argument, especially as blood flow restriction is migrating more and more into clinical populations. And we're able to now not only look at, the potential for safety, but now extend that to, better outcomes. But I will say, before we get into this, that we did our recent meta-analysis on 45 papers that looked at muscle strength, disability, pain, adverse response. We did not find a mediating relationship to type of pressure prescription. So I will say that in that analysis for mediating the response. But in the spirit of full disclosure, I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, I totally agree that pressure matters, and for all of those reasons. Like, I do strongly believe the research and all my clinical practice anecdotally fully support a pressure range mattering. Too low, you're not getting enough stimulus to create the fatigue response. Too high, and it's too discomforting. And then I don't want to just talk about discomfort, but like you and I both know, if you're in an extreme amount of discomfort, how are you going to recruit motor units at a high level when you're like you're in pain, and I don't just mean like burn pain. I mean, it's like too great. Like, there is that ceiling of too much pressure being not getting the return on investment you want. So of course that's true. So all the citations that you had stated, I agree with all the literature on that. Like, in the contention from the non-AOP group is not that pressure doesn't matter. It's more that you don't need AOP to be in that effective range. And so again, like, there's a number of studies that support that, but beyond the, like, if I was to go to like I mean, I'll try to pull a couple here, but like, we know that the downstream physiology isn't the same anyway. So like, when you're saying 80% has a bigger return on investment than 40, but then also a lot of studies that are published saying like, well, 50 is good, and there's been some 60% studies. So like, the more restrictive pressure, you do induce more fatigue, but also there's a little discomfort with that. And because we don't know that a wrap or a multi-chambered unit or like a Katsu using their skew units, we don't know the operation relative to arterial occlusion pressure. We don't know that they're not at 80%. You know what I mean? So the argument of what's your range of available pressure that you're working, well, non-AOP pressure prescription can also be in that effective range and be more than the 40 and less than the 80, but it's not relative to that. So we keep basing our metric on a measurement like arterial occlusion pressure, when all you need to do is make sure that you have enough restrictive pressure to induce fatigue and have a physiological response. And so too often, I think the research says, like, measure AOP, prescribe a percentage of AOP, that's going to deliver a targeted pressure and produce a standardized physiological response to produce an adaptation. And we know through Swain, Mouser, Hornicle, Crosley, Maladen, that when you measure AOP, you prescribe AOP, you know that there's device-specific features that have variability. You know there's participant-specific pressure variability. You know there's cardiovascular adaptation response, like, variability. You know that the flow reduction variability, and you know the metabolic stress and therefore adaptation variability. And so we're saying pressure matters, and we're saying that AOP can tap into that. And I'm like, I agree. It absolutely can. It's just not required to be effective. And therefore, all of those adaptation principles can happen with another way to restrict the flow of blood. And if you're not if you're operating too low, increase your restrictor pressure. If you're operating too high, decrease your restrictor pressure. And that sounds trite to say it that way, but that's not inaccurate still. The way that you're doing it with an AOP-based device obviously works. I'm only saying that what I worry about is the ongoing narrative that you have to do it that way to be safe and effective. And what that's doing is it's preferentially biasing a cuff type. And I just don't think that that's helpful when there's other ways that we can do it. And you just mentioned like Hydro, like as an example of a successful BFR type practice, as well as Katsu, which was the origin of all of BFR originally in the first place, like standardizing BFR practices in the first place. And it's still widely accepted and successful and safe and effective and all those things. And publications in the Japanese literature are I mean, they're vast. They have tons of publications in their application of safe and effective BFR utilization. And so again, I'm going to circle back to the same narrative that I have, that yes, I agree that pressure matters. Yes, I agree there's too low of a pressure and too high of a pressure. And yes, I agree that AOP can help navigate that. It's just, again, it's not necessary. That's all.
So I'm not trying to box you in here.
Yeah.
But let's go back, since you kind of agreed a little bit and understand, and by the way, I also agree. However,
Sure.
we're in trying okay. So if we know, right, based on at least 3 or 4 of these studies in clinical populations now, that higher pressures tend to get better results. Okay. Now, if would you agree that if someone is coming to see you, that you want to give them the best possible stimulus that they can get to get the best possible results, all things being equal?
I mean, sure, I would love to do that. You finish your thing, but I have a so sure. You want to optimize things.
So again, it's more like that. It's like, okay, if we're already knowing that there's a pressure dependent relationship that exists, we do know, and I do concede, it's very well established that AOP restriction, which you didn't talk about, but I'll just bring it up to the rear, is not linear. 40% of AOP, 40% AOP is not 40% of the reduction in blood flow, and vice versa, right? There is a plateau. So it's not just about the restrictive pressure. However, even if we're talking about that and we understand that, yes, there's not a real sharp drop between potentially 40 to 50% limb occlusion pressure and 70 to 80% limb occlusion pressure, right? But we understand that for some reason, we get better, statistically at least, results using 80% versus 40%.
Sure.
Why would we not try to give our patients 80% all the time? And again, I'm not an 80% zealot. I actually think 80% is very high. And
I agree.
It's whatever. But just from a research perspective and a thought exercise,
Yeah.
if we know full well that there is if we did X, Y, and Z on this protocol, and now we know that if we use 80%, that we're going to be more likely to put our client in that bucket of better responders than less than that pressure, why would we not try to do that pressure?
Yeah. So I hear your point. Can we agree that we're using restrictive pressure to talk about dosing? Is that fair to say, like, we're trying to dose something, right? Like,
well, because remember, right? And here's the thing, is that yes, it's about dosing. However, when you're thinking about, like, when I think about the model of blood flow restriction inside my head, which is we have a couple levers to get to that actual stimulus response. And again, mind you, research based, right? But everything is about research. Like, people want to know research and see research. So, like, if we're doing identical programs and we have one lever that we can pull that gives you 80%, and yes, it sucks, it's more uncomfortable, whatever it is, but it gets better outcomes than doing a lower lever.
It gives an aggregate better bang of a conceive.
Sure.
So that's where but that's where my individualization, like, even like, so like, you're very much in the space. American College of Sports Medicine just revamped their whole strength and conditioning principles. And ultimately, right, like, your reaction to that's my reaction to that. They basically came out and said, like, we're basically a little bit more on response driven stuff. We're on intensity and effort. We're on reps and reserve. We're on things that you and I have probably been doing for a really long time versus like, oh, for hypertrophy, you need set rep schemes that look like this, like in X percentage of your 1 rep max to gain, whatever. It's like, what you need is type 2 motor unit recruitment and fatigue based stimulus, right? And among other things, I'm simplifying, but that's still true. And my argument is still, what happens at 70%? Like you said, you're not an 80% zealot. I'm like, that exact person might actually be better at 70%. And you're saying, yeah, but I'm still trying to say, but I can measure that and I can dose to that. And I'm saying, if you have a cuff that you just kind of one more pump and you just tick it up a little bit because you're going on a response driven dosage so that they can get the fatigue anyway, then that's the individualization that you need. And it doesn't have to be a percentage of what we know is a non-linear measurement. And that's my hang up, is we know it's non-linear. And even in that Maladen article, the way they talked about, like, they use this, because you're saying it's the same lever. And like, they use the same lever and it was different in every single person. The downstream physiology was different. So like the levers, the external, my contention again, and I think the non-AOP group's contention is the AOP measurement is an external measurement that we're standardizing to, but it is not a standardized physiological response. And so just because we're getting, I'm going to use the word better again, results with more pressure, it's like, sure, you're restricting more, but the downstream physiology is still vastly varied. And we auto-regulate as humans for whatever the restrictive pressure is. And we can agree to that. It's just, you're trying to pull a lever and make it be consistent. I'm just saying, like, it's still not, though. It's still statistically not the lever that is consistent, because the downstream physiology is not. The metabolite accumulation varies, the oxygen saturation varies, the blood flow reduction rate varies, like the intensity, like the tolerance for the patient varies. Like the cardiorespiratory, the cardiac output varies. Like we know that the AOP still varies even though you have a set measurement. And so because of that, there's still room, in my opinion, and in the literature's opinion, there's room for non-AOP to fit in that mold. That's my contention. And so you're saying, I just want to pull this one lever and make it easy. I was like, but it's not easy. It's still individualized, and non-AOP can still fit in that mold. And we don't know that 80% for this given patient isn't better than 65%. We know it's better than 40, and we know on aggregate 80 is better, but better, again, I'm getting some quotes, but it's still gray. And we just want to standardize. We want to research. We want to say it's that way, but like the human body's so adaptive that we can't even agree on the same exercise to do, the same weight to use, the same percentage to, like, so how could we say that dosing BFR we could all agree that this is the window we're working in? That's all.
Are you a leader in the rehab and fitness industry? Are you ready to meet the growing demand of BFR trained providers? Get our complete on-demand BFR training certification course now and get over 7 hours of continuing education by clicking the link on this page.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of goes into the third question, because I do want to respond to that, because conceptually I agree. But I agree in the sense of there's an individualized response, and we as clinicians should be able to adjust our different levers in order to meet the patient. But at the same time, when we're thinking about something that's a medicalized intervention, which we are restricting blood flow. Yes, we can make it more rather than less medicalized. For example, the more medicalized approach, I would be more AOP based. Why? Because it's more of like a pseudo tourniquet. A less medicalized approach is something like a B-Strong, multi-chambered, Katsu, in some sense, right? Because you can get LOP, AOP with Katsu. And it is able to be applied in, cardiovascular populations. There is evidence on that.
Correct.
But it's very challenging to say, okay, and this goes into the third question, which is, does AOP help or hurt external validity and real world applicability? I think this is the exact example where AOP would help and non-AOP doesn't. It's because when you're dealing with, for example, cardiovascular populations, not everyone has a Katsu unit, but we both know that and we both would agree that the fatiguing effects of blood flow restriction are going to exist regardless of whatever pressure application we're going to apply, unless it's literally nothing, like sham, right? We're going to get some fatigability. We're going to get a slightly more to maybe a lot more metabolic stress induced fatigue. Great. right? But when you're dealing with individuals that are, medically compromised in some degree, studying something like a Katsu system in a cardiovascular population, which again, I use Katsu pretty much every day now. Like that's my actual cuff that I've been using more times than not, only because I haven't had a lot of experience with it. And I've been interested in the cycle program. So that's just aside. So like, I'm not speaking about it bashing Katsu because I do really like their product. But when we think about studying it, right? I'm a clinician. I'm working with individuals that are just post-CABG surgery, right? Uh, Research has been done, but like now I'm using a cuff that's not Katsu. So what pressure do I use? An individualized approach? Yeah, it's sure it sounds good on paper, but like okay, like if I'm actually manipulating blood flow in some way, shape, or form on these patients, I'd like to know that there's been research done on those individuals using an AOP based approach, understanding their tolerances, etc. The same thing applies for the neurologic populations. Like I have a couple of patients that have MS. And so understanding, that there is apprehension just in general using blood flow restriction, but now understanding that, hey, I can point to studies that have used AOP and understanding, all right, what is the relative response of these patients for XYZ? And so it helps bring the research into a real world practical application setting. It provides, as we said in the paper, a common physiologic currency, allowing us to compare individuals across varying different studies. Because what we do know is that acute response to AOP, meaning a resting response, and then an acute exercise response, regardless of the different cuff architecture, right? If it's a single chambered, even if it's a single chambered elastic, or if it's a single chambered nylon, right? If we set it relative to AOP, the acute physiologic response is the same. Restriction in blood flow at rest is the same. Not saying that again, just comparing, right, differences in between. And in fact, you mentioned it before, like the differences in response. Well, the Crossley paper, I think the AOP only changed about 20 millimeters of mercury. I joke around, what's 20 millimeters of mercury between friends? Like it's basically just exceeding what would be acceptable range in a medical tourniquet of 15 millimeters of mercury, right? So, those are the things where it's like, okay, we have all that information. Now, okay, what do we do with it? And I think that one of the counterpoint papers that that was brought up was the Rosso study, Rosso, whatever, where they used basically the same pressure that was applied to a wide cuff that was to a narrow cuff. And so obviously you're going to have differences in the magnitude of responses. And that's what I poke fun at Sten at, right? For his walking paper, right? Because, it was like just creating a massive environment, difference between the two different cuffs. I understand why he did it, but if I guarantee you, I wouldn't even bet, I would guarantee you that if you standardize the relative pressure to the wide cuff and the narrow cuff, the responses would not be different. It would be identical. And the problem currently that exists in the research is that individuals are not really reporting why they're using the chosen pressure and why they're that's a barrier to the long-term adoption of AOP, and particularly in field-based settings where those individuals, you need a Doppler or you need a pulse ox, and you need a good pulse ox, because I've used crappy pulse oxes and they're not good.
There's some bad
right?
ones.
You need an expensive pulse ox, which is basically the same cost as a Doppler. So why don't you go just get a Doppler? Or you need, any sort of these other adjacent technologies to be able to assess arterial or limb occlusion pressure. And so a lot of these coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, which now have changed, by the way, if you look at the most recent surveys in strength and conditioning coaches, they're now reporting a lot of AOP usage, but nonetheless, the barriers to adoption of this AOP, imperfect as it is, has gotten better and better. And so it's for me, it's okay, well, if you have the capability, and your cuff is designed for AOP, which is really important because, some cuffs aren't, and then it's a useless metric. I would totally agree. But that's also a problem that exists right now in the research, which I'm happy that Sten's paper that talked about this, he looked at it semi-elastic pneumatic or whatever.
Right.
but like that we're actually having these discussions because you're getting into problems that exist just yesterday in the plus one about the using the multi-chambered cup, but then applying a single chambered, limb circumference, measurement. And so that's where, there is barriers to adoption of AOP, but those barriers now are getting less and less and less. And I think the barrier that now is existing is more that people are getting into the space and just want to start publishing on blood flow restriction without actually saying, oh, wait, actually, there is some nuance that needs to be considered when you're, applying something to an individual, and not just saying, oh, okay, BFR, I'm likely to get funded, because BFR is hot. And especially now with the hydro coverage, there's going to be more interest in there, things like that, where it's just like, come on. So an imperfect measure, as I mentioned before, is not, cause for complete, bye-bye with the measure, but understanding that there is some nuance even within the device characteristics and features to be able to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I would listen. I think like we're going back to the same kind of things because I think we have to keep caveating our position enough to say like when you're wanting to make sure that medical safety, like that's a thought that we're having. But like I agree with that you want to have that defensibility, but like I can tell you firsthand that there are medical clinics all through my region that are regularly using non-AOP devices and have thousands or tens of thousands of repetitions without, and I don't want to even put it out in the ether, adverse events with non-AOP measurements because they're using products and devices that don't have to account for that. And if you can survey their patients who are rapidly fatiguing by utilization of those products, I mean, I know that seems anecdotal when I'm saying it that way because you're saying you want to be able to cite research and defensively have your claim, but it's like, yeah, because it's an under-researched space. And part of the reason it's under-researched is the companies that are non-AOP need to do a better job of publishing. I would totally agree with that. But I would also argue that it's really a lot easier for the tourniquet-based AOP companies to do publications because they have an immediate measurement that they can use, and that helps in literature and helps in research. And I agree with that. I wish non-AOP could be better in the sense of a measurable number. I still contend that number, not that number doesn't matter. AOP matters. I'm just saying it only matters in that you're not over and you're not under and you're in this big range with a product capable of that. And so I just keep going back to that because we know that the downstream physiology, and I keep saying it this way, is still varied in populations. And as long as you're in here, it doesn't matter how you're getting here. And the argument that you're making is a very good argument in that, well, how do you know if you're not measuring that and you're not accounting for that? And I'm just saying you still can do that in clinical populations with a response-driven system. Like you still can say, I'm restricting your blood flow with any number of these products. I'm not trying to promote any product, but any number of the products that are elastic in nature, even the elastic wraps that are being used. And I don't like that, but I'm just saying like that has lots of success, lots of publications, and you can't ignore that. And it still works and is effective. And that's across populations that's been studied as well. So I'm not ignoring that literature. I'm just saying, I'm not suggesting that you just use perceived tightness. I get that that's been kind of countered on how tight is this. I'm more talking about fatigue response and making sure that you're in, again, I'm talking about dosing for restrictor pressure. Anytime I teach a course or anytime I talk about this, people always ask me, should I increase the pressure or increase the load? And I'm always in the camp of whatever your body can tolerate more naturally without any environment that you're creating, like a pseudo environment, go ahead and do so. But if you're tolerating those heavier loads, then go ahead and do that without as much restrictor pressure. You don't just pump it up to be restrictive for whatever reason, but are you getting the, again, safe restriction, and how are you doing that? And it's like so let me just stop by saying, like, just because AOP is available and it's appropriate, it doesn't mean that it's necessary. And because the cost and the like reproducibility, like we're talking about, like, oh, AOP devices are more and more out there, I'm gonna push back on that a little bit and say, yeah, but there's been just a study last year that said those devices aren't even doing what they're saying they're doing consistently. So like we're saying the measurement has value, and in theory we're doing all this, but like when we measure it, you're saying the fluctuation is forgivable, and I'm saying, yeah, but it's still, we're talking about precision here by a measurement and it's not precise. And that is still my contention, I guess.
Yeah, I think we're talking more about precision at rest versus precision during exercise.
Sure.
I do think that there. I'm not convinced. Let's just say that the fluctuation during the exercise itself, like during the non-contraction phase, is something that we need to be extremely concerned with. Given the low loads that we're using, I think
Mm.
that concern increases the higher, the loading paradigm that we go.
Yeah.
Because now you're increasing the arterial. You're just doing more and more strain to the vascular
Yeah,
system.
you're stressing your vasculature when you have it restricted and then you add heavier loads. I agree totally.
Yeah,
That's
so
not
like
wise.
it's more about, for me, as I mentioned before, it's really about during the resting period, because we already know that there's going to be intramuscular occlusion between 25 and 35% in the quad, at least, which that actually extends to the triceps. There's other muscle groups that have looked at isometric, occlusion, which really is what we care about, because the isometric, the actual contraction, the muscle fiber is still, I mean, yes, the muscle is going dynamically, but in general, like, the isometric is going to create that compression of the microvasculature. So in my mind, my theory, it shouldn't have an impact whether it's isometric or isotonic. At the end of the day, it's still compressing that, the microvasculature. So that's the relevant piece. But I do think, again, it goes back to the whole notion of like, I think where uh, I think we can agree is, you're saying that if you have a single chambered system that has the ability to occlude, then it's y- y- you not ascribing some sort of limb occlusion pressure or arterial occlusion pressure is probably more rather than less reckless, given the capacity to occlude blood flow. If that's your position, great. I fully agree.
Yeah.
I also would want to say that, it first of all, I don't think that, and then this is where some of the arguments come about from from other people that are like, even it's like, it's not a safety issue for a multi-chamber cuff. It's not a safety issue for a Katsu cuff. Like, or any of the other, like, brands that I'm forgetting, that might be more narrow elastic or whatever. Cause I honestly I'm not concerned about safety pretty much at all
Yeah.
in these designs. And so that's why, for me, when you're thinking about integration in the clinical context, sure, by all means, like, I am definitely more of the camp of, if you're using a small multi-chambered cuff and you're using a clinical population, by all means. Why? Because it doesn't really have the chance to significantly occlude. We know it doesn't even be able to restrict arterial flow by any significant degree. We have evidence up to 500 millimeters of mercury, right? So it's not necessarily a safety thing. It's more of a programming thing at that point for you to reach that barometer. I guess that's where the disconnect is, and that's what I worry about in the literature at large, is that people are conflating the design characteristics with the approach and basically being it ubiquitous, which
Yes.
is the problem. And
I
so
agree with you.
and really, that's like, at the end of the day, I think that if I was ever called and somebody was like, "Oh yeah, I'm not using AOP," and some adverse event happened, I'm like, "Well, did you assess anything? Like, what are you doing?" It's like, honestly, it's negligence at that point, right? But if you're using a design where the cuff is literally not able to occlude in any way, shape, or form, I don't see the problem with using a non-arbitrary approach, because you can't get AOP anyways. So it's like, it's
Yeah.
not like you're not going to use blood flow restriction. You're going to have to take in other adjacent things. And that's where I think the biggest challenges in general is understanding that the nuance with that. Because, in fact, as I said before, I do recommend, if you're a trainer, I always point in the direction of, the multi-chamber cuff, or, moving forward, specifically, Katsu, because they have a less capability just due to their design. And specifically, Katsu could definitely occlude in the upper extremity, not in the lower extremity, but specifically the cycle program, the
Yeah.
device
Yeah.
feature with the Katsu. Like, I'm like, okay, as long as that's on and you're good to go, by all means. Like, you don't need a specific pressure, because the occlusion or the restriction stimulus is short. So it's not like you're going to be prolonged, duration.
Are you a leader in the rehab and fitness industry? Are you ready to meet the growing demand of BFR trained providers? Get our complete on-demand BFR training certification course now and get over 7 hours of continuing education by clicking the link on this page.
But
Yeah, and that continuous intermittent argument is part. We don't have to go into the weeds of that too, but like you, you're saying all of the things that like I think the nuance of this discussion are where I I am kind of pulled to just try to challenge, are we talking about AOP and device product features? Then I'm going to concede that for sure. If we're talking about AOP as anything that's not AOP is negligent, I push back hard on that. And I think that there are people that are saying that. And that's where I feel like that's not accurate.
I think we can both agree though that, okay, you have a multi-million I'm just saying theoretically, and I know we're running, a little.
Oh yeah, we got it right.
Yeah, let my next guy know we're good. So we wrap up after this. But I do think that this is this point right here is going to be a big take home. You have a multi-million-dollar grant, okay, and you're designing a clinical trial with, let's just say anterior cruciate ligament reconstruction. Let's just keep it to very orthopedic or whatever.
Yep.
Right. And you have all this money to spend. Why would you not use a technology that you can make you basically can make as precise, make your intervention as precise as possible, even though we fully admit there's imprecision.
Sure.
Right. So like, that's the problem. I don't have an issue. As I said, I don't have a dog in the fight. Like I could care less who wins or who lose, whatever.
Yeah.
All I care about is like, okay, we're trying to learn about blood flow restriction. I get your point. I totally do. Because everything should be dosed. But I said this before in multiple podcasts, is that we have a normal, and you mentioned this already. There's an individualized response. This happens in exercise science.
Right.
There's an individualized response. You have people that are hyper responders, you have people that are non-responders, and everything in between. Now, you add on top of that exercise intervention, you're now adding another layer of heterogeneity, of potential source of heterogeneity. So, and that's including cuff design, that's including the amount of applied pressure, that's including any sort of device feature like auto regulation, things like that, that can further increase the heterogeneity and the individualized response.
Yep.
So my whole thing as a clinician researcher is, why not spend that money, that multi-million-dollar grant, on using something that is going to have the most transmissibility to everyone? Because, for example, if you're doing, and this is where it circles back to the non-AOP approach, you're saying, okay, I'm good with that. And I can then say, okay, we studied that. We get the idea that, hey, maybe there is a positive response, right? In the literature, it looks like it's trending that way. So, okay, we have the benchmarks. We now know that at X pressure relative to that person, we have a therapeutic effect. Great. So that satisfies the AOP camp. Number two, you say, all right, well, we don't ascribe to that, but you know what? We know that if we get XYZ, like total, maybe we individualize it more and like we add a little bit more volume, or we do something to pull on another lever, that we don't need to use the AOP based approach, but we have at least efficacy in this particular population with a more intense, because AOP is definitely, can be more intense if we're talking about it in multi-chamber versus a single chamber approach, more intense form of blood flow restriction. But we can now say, oh, there's been research done on a higher pressure system. So now we have a way to scale back, but still operate with the flexibility of progressive overload and long-term, improvements in function or whatever. And that's kind of where, I sit, where it's like tough to be able to say, okay, let's spend that money on an approach that we can't fully individualize, even though I know you as a clinician will do your best to give the best, most individualized prescription possible. When we're dealing with the totality of clinicians that will be operating on this, that are using that may not have the facility to pull different levers, having that lever be firm in an AOP based prescription makes the most sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's hard to argue with the logic of that, except my contention remains the same in that it's a precise external measure. It's just an imprecise physiological measure. And so because of that imprecision, I get your stance on it. I get most people's stance on it. It makes sense. I would like it to be easier than it is. It's just, for example, if we use that grant example, like if I had all of that money, I would do that. I would say, all right, everybody's at 70% AOP. We're doing the same programming. And that way we'll have a study on this population. And then I would do another study with non-AOP that would allow for dose changes in restrictor pressure. Like, again, cuff inflation. Like if I use 350 for a multi-chamber unit, and then I was allowed to go up to 400 or down to 3.25 as I felt the response and the programming allowed for it. But it's still, but the argument is, well, now you're varying the restrictive pressure, and therefore the study itself is going to be skewed and flawed. I'm like, well, that's the whole point of this style of BFR, is the variability of it, and the rigidness of AOP is in that rigidity. And it's like, yeah, because we want to have that lever be consistent across the board. And I would say, yeah, that works. That's a good way to do it. Go right ahead. Go ahead, like truly do it. I think you're gonna keep finding study after study is gonna show that that's a good approach. I have no question that using BFR with AOP and studying it the way you just mentioned will continue to be successful. My contention remains, it's not the necessary way to have it happen, and it's not necessary for safety, and it's not necessary for efficacy. It's just, yeah, but it's easier. We can measure it. We can just go. And I'm like, yeah, but you just don't need to do it that way. You can, and it works, and it will work. I just feel like I've seen it happen for the last 8 years without needing that. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of times. And the publications that are out there also show that. It's just, we keep wanting to get this precision, but I keep saying it's an external precision. And even at rest, it's an okay at best internal measurement at best, but it's truly varied. And the research keeps showing it's varied in individual and in day and in session and all that. Like, yeah, but it's better than what else we have. And I'm like, I hear that. It's just the language behind necessity and optimized and precision is just not accurate. And so I'm just trying to push back on that and try to push it towards, we can still do this differently, even if one is better per the research, right? And like your point is, Joel, I'd much rather measure something and much rather go forward doing it this way. And I'm like, yeah, you should continue to do so. It's clearly working. It's a good approach. It's just the other approaches have not shown that they're not effective and not safe. So I just am going to keep pushing back that you have to do it that way there, or you're not as good in the space. You're not doing your due diligence for your patient population. I mean, I think I'll die on that hill that I don't agree with that. So that's my contention still. I'd love to see more studies on non-AOP that can figure out how to do better, because I think the AOP camp is going to continue to publish because it's easier, because it's a number that you're benchmarking. So it's easy to study that. Like here, we did this, and then we did these things, and this was the result. And non-AOP has to deal with the ambiguity of restrictive pressure that isn't measuring a metric like that, which is a flaw in the system.
Listen,
yeah,
I think at the end of the day, we can agree that this is an argument or a discussion more about the fact that that we want how we are individualizing it, basically.
Yeah.
So like,
agreed.
I'm thinking that, or I'm arguing, or my position, whatever, is that restrictive pressure needs to be individualized. And, and you're talking about, okay, I agree, but that's not, it doesn't necessarily have to be through AOP specific, means alone.
Sure.
So I think that probably, hammers away the gist of the podcast. in an effort, because I got to scoot. Tell people where they should find you, and any other last minute things that you want to plug.
Yeah, I mean, just I have a site. It's called My Performance Rehab, and I do some BFR education and through that space. But I'm on Instagram at Joel Novak PT, Twitter, uh, LinkedIn, all of that. Just interested in talking more, learning more, discussing more. Like I love this space. I consistently agree with Nick a lot of times. We were on the same page with a lot of this, and I think we just are passionate about trying to make sure that the literature reflects the true application of BFR, and that we are using the products and the designs the way that they were meant to be designed, and we're not extrapolating one thing we read and studied into another application, because that's not what we mean. We are really on the same page with all that a lot. And so my last outro is just going to be that like I am absolutely not anti-AOP. So like it's not the only way to get to the crux of BFR. And that is, I think there's some onus on the non-AOP population and the products themselves to get out there and do a little bit more studies a little bit to kind of support that more. But the ones that are out there are pretty good, and the variation in AOP is still true, but it works. I don't think you're going to convince me, not you. I don't think the AOP literature is going to convince me that it's a necessity is all. Yeah, man.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Dude, great. I loved it. We should talk again sometime. It's a good space. I love talking to you about it all.
For sure. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks for making it to the end. Bye. And that was today's episode of the BFR Better for Results podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, I would love if you subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're watching or listening on. I really appreciate the support.